Hey, I'm Daniel. I spent 20 years as a professor of religious history. Then I discovered something that cost me my career, but I couldn't keep it to myself. What Spinoza found, it changes everything you think you know.
Stop trusting the location they gave you. Spinoza traced where Jesus' body actually is and was attacked with a knife 48 hours later. He kept the slashed cloak. The institution that ordered the attack still controls the answer. I want to say that again with more precision, because the sequence of events matters enormously to what I'm about to show you. April 1655, Amsterdam. A philosopher steps out into the street, the Portuguese Jewish quarter, the narrow canals, the grey particular light of a Dutch city in spring. He had been working for years on a question that the institutions around him did not want asked. A question not about whether Jesus was divine, but about something more specific, and in certain respects, more disturbing, about where Jesus' body was, about why the location that has been given to the world for 17 centuries was identified not by anyone who had been there, not by any witness, but by an emperor's mother in a different century altogether, under circumstances that were explicitly political. Someone came at Spinoza with a knife, slashed his cloak, missed. He kept the cloak, the slashed cloak, the damaged fabric, the visible proof of what someone had tried to do, and he kept it. Not repaired, not discarded. Kept, and apparently worn, because the testimony we have describes him continuing to use it. I have spent a long time thinking about what it means to keep a slashed cloak. In a moment, I will tell you what Spinoza found. But first you need to understand why the attack matters. Because the attack is not background to this story. The attack is the argument. There are 3 candidate locations for the tomb of Jesus, and they have very different histories. The first is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which has been the official answer of the institutional church since the 4th century. The second is the Talpiot tomb discovered in 1980 in East Jerusalem, which contains an ossuary, a bone box, inscribed with the Aramaic name Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus, son of Joseph. The third is the Garden Tomb, a site proposed in the 19th century by the British General Charles Gordon on largely aesthetic grounds, subsequently rejected by the majority of archaeologists who examined it. I want to stay with that first option and ask a specific question, not whether the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is authentic. That is a theological question, and I am not equipped to answer it. The question I want to ask is a historical one. When was it identified? By whom? Under what circumstances? And what does the 300-year gap between the death of Jesus and the identification of the site tell us about the process by which it was selected? The institution that ordered the attack on Spinoza in 1655 didn't disappear. It still controls where you're allowed to look. Here is what the record shows. Jesus of Nazareth is believed to have been crucified and buried approximately 30 years before the Common Era. The earliest surviving Christian texts, the letters of Paul, composed in the 50s of the 1st century, contain not a single reference to the location of a tomb. Paul's theological framework is built entirely on the resurrection, on the claim that the body was no longer in the tomb. The tomb itself, its location, its physical address in 1st century Jerusalem, is never mentioned. The Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John were composed between approximately 70 and 110 of the Common Era. They describe the burial of Jesus in a tomb belonging to a man called Joseph of Arimathea. But they do not give the tomb a recoverable location. They do not describe it in terms that would allow a reader 3 centuries later to say, here, this place, this specific site. For roughly 300 years of early Christianity, the period when the tradition was forming, when the churches were being established, when the martyrs were dying, when the theology was being hammered out in council after council, nobody identified the location of Jesus' tomb as a matter of central importance. Nobody established a pilgrimage site. Nobody appears to have preserved, within the living tradition, the specific address of the burial. There are 3 things about the tomb of Jesus that Spinoza identified. The third one is the one nobody discusses, and that's when the pattern becomes visible. But before I get to that, let me show you exactly when and how the location was finally established. The obvious explanation is that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was always there, always known, always visited. Simple. But then you look at when the identification was made. The year is 326 of the Common Era. Not 30, not 100, not 200, 326. Nearly 3 centuries after the crucifixion, Helena, the elderly mother of the Emperor Constantine, travels to Jerusalem on what is described as a pilgrimage of devotion. She is at this point in her 80s. She has been a Christian by most accounts for a relatively short period relative to her life. Her son Constantine has, the previous year, convened the Council of Nicaea to settle the theological disputes that were threatening to fracture the empire he had spent his career consolidating. A unified empire required a unified church. A unified church required a settled theology. A settled theology would benefit enormously from fixed sacred sites, places of pilgrimage, places of institutional authority, places where the divine geography of the tradition could be walked and touched and prayed at. Helena identified the site. She oversaw the demolition of a pagan temple that she determined was standing on the location of the tomb. A church was built, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I need to warn you, what I'm about to show you dismantles one of the most cited foundations of institutional Christianity, the mortar analysis. In 2016, during restoration work at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, archaeologists were able to obtain mortar samples from the tomb chamber. The samples were dated using a method called optically stimulated luminescence, a precise technique that establishes when specific mineral grains were last exposed to light, which corresponds to when the mortar was mixed and laid. The results, published through National Geographic and subsequently reviewed in the archaeological literature, dated the construction of the tomb chamber to the 4th century of the Common Era, not the 1st century, not the period of the crucifixion, the 4th century, the period of Constantine, the period of Helena. The physical fabric of the most sacred site in institutional Christianity was built in the century of the identification, not the century of the event. I want to be absolutely careful about what this proves and what it does not prove. It does not prove that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not the authentic location of the tomb. It is conceivable that Helena's identification was correct, that the site was known within the local Christian community across the 3-century gap, and that what the mortar analysis confirms is simply that the original burial structure was replaced by a purpose-built shrine in the 4th century. That interpretation is available. What the mortar analysis does prove is this: there is no physical continuity between the 1st century tomb and the structure that now stands at that location. What you visit at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a 4th century construction built on a site identified by imperial decree for political purposes. After a 300-year silence, the evidence says one thing, the institution says another, and the gap between them is exactly where Spinoza was working. In the middle of the 1650s, Spinoza was conducting a sustained investigation into how religious narratives are constructed, how they serve institutional purposes, and how the gap between the original documents and the institutional claims built on them can be measured by anyone willing to read carefully. His analysis of the biblical texts as human productions made in history, carrying the marks of their making, led him inevitably to the question of what the absence of evidence for a tomb location in the first 3 centuries actually tells us. Spinoza's conclusion about where the body is or isn't is not what you'd expect. It's more disturbing. He was not arguing that Jesus did not exist. He was not arguing that the resurrection did not occur. That was a theological question he handled carefully and at a different level of analysis. What he argued, and this is the claim that I think explains the knife in April 1655, was that the narrative about where Jesus' body was, or was not, had been deliberately constructed to sustain a specific structure of authority. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. A religion whose founder was buried in a specific locatable tomb faces a different set of institutional requirements than a religion whose founder's burial place is unknown and whose tomb is therefore, in a specific sense, everywhere and nowhere at once. If the tomb is here, it can be controlled. Access to it can be regulated, monetized, claimed as sacred territory. The institution that controls the tomb controls the geography of the sacred. If the tomb is unknown, if nobody knows where the body is, The resurrection claim is, in one sense, more available. There is no inconvenient physical sight. There is no possibility of someone examining the physical evidence and reaching inconvenient conclusions. Spinoza's argument, rooted in the analysis of texts he was among the first to read with full methodological rigor, was that both the uncertainty about the location and the eventual institutionalization of a specific location serve the same authority. The 300-year silence served one kind of theological argument. The eventual identification served another. What they have in common is that neither was driven by historical investigation. And here is where I want to tell you about a night in Norwich. This would have been perhaps a decade before I began this research. The study where I work had the particular quiet of late evening, the lamp on the desk, the rest of the room in shadow, the cold that seeps into old stone houses in autumn and is never entirely gone until May. I had been reading without any specific agenda for once, going between a volume on the Dead Sea Scrolls and the relevant chapter in a history of the early church. The tea on the edge of the desk had been there long enough that I had stopped expecting it to be warm. The passage that arrested me was not about the tomb at all. It was about Spinoza's 1770 work, his analysis of the biblical texts, published anonymously, with a false city of publication on the title page, because its author knew precisely what he was doing. The passage was a summary of Spinoza's argument about how narratives concerning the physical absence of founders construct religious authority. The argument that the absence of a body is not merely a theological claim, it is an institutional instrument. I put down the Dead Sea Scrolls volume. I read the summary again. And what I understood, not for the first time, but more sharply than before, was that the question Spinoza was asking about Jesus' burial was not primarily a historical question. It was a structural question. He was asking, who benefits from the particular version of this story that has been taught? The tea was cold, the lamp was still on, and outside the Norwich street was absolutely silent. I want to be careful here, because what I'm saying applies not just to Christianity, but to the community that tried to kill Spinoza. The Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1655 was a specific kind of institution. Its members had, many of them, come from families who had converted to Christianity in Spain and Portugal under threat of persecution, then reconverted to Judaism on arriving in the more tolerant Netherlands. The community understood, with a specificity born from experience, the cost of heterodoxy, the cost of asking inconvenient questions about the foundations of the faith. When Spinoza asked those questions, when he began investigating the historical origins of the biblical texts, when he began applying his analytical method to narratives that both Christianity and Judaism had an institutional interest in maintaining, he was threatening not one institution but two. The narrative about Jesus' burial was not irrelevant to the Jewish community. If the location of Jesus' body could be established archaeologically, or if the process by which the institutional location was chosen could be shown to be politically motivated, the theological claim that the body was absent, the resurrection, would need to be addressed. The Jewish community's long-standing rejection of that claim would need a different kind of evidentiary basis. Both communities had reasons to prefer the question unasked. The knife in April 1655 came from within the Jewish community, not from Christian authorities. The cherem that followed in July 1656, the most extreme formal excommunication in the history of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community, was issued by Jewish authority. And here is where it gets genuinely dangerous for the historical record. I want to tell you about something I heard at a conference. This was the early part of this century, a gathering of scholars working in 17th century Jewish and Dutch intellectual history, north of England, the kind of conference where the formal sessions are careful and the real material comes out in the corridors. I was standing near the entrance to one of the session rooms. A colleague of mine, a scholar who had spent years working with the original documents of the Amsterdam Portuguese Jewish community, the administrative records, the correspondence, the formal legal texts, was looking at something in a manila folder. He turned and said something that I have thought about many times since. He said that the text of Spinoza's cherem, when you read the original Portuguese and Hebrew, does not read like a theological document. It reads like a legal instrument of information suppression. The language, the Standard English translation does not capture this, uses phrases from the community's internal regulatory tradition that specifically prohibit the reproduction, transmission, and discussion of a condemned person's work. It is not a statement of theological disagreement. It is a protocol for ensuring that whatever Spinoza had found would not circulate. He closed the folder, said something about the session starting, moved on. I stood there in the corridor for a moment, not immediately processing. Then, quietly, yes. The cherem was not a punishment. It was an archive procedure. There is a word for what was done to Spinoza's work in 1656. The word is suppression, not refutation, not debate, not the normal process by which an argument is engaged and found wanting, and left to make its case in the court of subsequent scholarship. The cherem's language explicitly extends to anyone who had any contact with him, read anything he wrote, or transmitted any of his work. This is the language of quarantine. You quarantine an argument that you cannot defeat. You do not quarantine an argument that is simply wrong. The Talpiot tomb was discovered on the 28th of March 1980 during construction work in East Talpiot, a neighborhood of Jerusalem. A bulldozer hit a burial chamber. Work stopped. The Israel Antiquities Authority was notified. The archaeologist assigned to document the site spent weeks cataloging what was inside. 10 ossuaries, bone boxes, carved from chalk limestone, used in 1st century Jerusalem for the secondary burial of bones after the flesh had decomposed. 6 of the 10 had inscriptions. The inscriptions Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus son of Joseph; Maria, a form of Mary; Yose, a diminutive of Joseph, the name of one of Jesus' brothers mentioned in the Gospel of Mark; Yehuda bar Yeshua, Judah son of Jesus; Mattia, Matthew; and one that has been read as Maria Mene Mara, a form of Mary Magdalene. The mainstream scholarly response to the Talpiot tomb was immediate and consistent. The names were common. Jesus, Joseph, Mary, these were among the most frequently occurring names in 1st century Judea. Finding them in a single tomb proves nothing, because you would expect to find them together in any tomb of the period. That objection is the right objection to raise. The problem is that it is not the complete analysis. In 2005, a statistician at the University of Toronto published a probability analysis of the Talpiot name cluster. The question is not whether any individual name is common. The question is whether the specific combination, Jesus son of Joseph together with a Maria, a Yose, and a Maria Mene, is statistically significant. The analysis, subsequently contested and refined in the academic literature, found that the probability of the combination occurring by chance in a tomb of the period, at a specific site with the specific family composition implied, was in the range of 1 in several hundred. That is not proof. It is a probability estimate that has been disputed. But it is not nothing. And the nature of the institutional response to the Talpiot tomb is worth noting. The Israeli Antiquities Authority resealed the tomb after initial documentation. The ossuaries were placed in storage. For years, the site received relatively little systematic analysis. When a documentary was produced in 2007 arguing that the Talpiot tomb was the family tomb of Jesus of Nazareth, the response from both academic and religious institutions was swift, largely dismissive, and in some cases, disproportionately heated. The question I want to ask is not whether the Talpiot tomb is the tomb of Jesus of Nazareth. The archaeological evidence is genuinely inconclusive. What I want to ask is whether the Talpiot tomb was investigated with the rigor that a potentially significant archaeological finding deserved, or whether the investigation was shaped, from the beginning, by institutional pressure about what conclusion would be tolerable. Spinoza would have recognized the mechanism. He described it in his 1770 work. Not about the Talpiot tomb, obviously, about the general principle that institutions suppress not what they can disprove, but what they cannot afford to examine fully. Now I want to ask you to sit with a specific coincidence, not because I want you to overinterpret it, because I want you to feel what it means that the dates align this way. In April 1655, someone in Amsterdam came at Spinoza with a knife. He survived. He kept the cloak. In July 1656, 14 months later, the community that had harbored the knife wielder issued the most extreme formal excommunication in its history against Spinoza. Not a moderate censure, not a suspension, the most severe formal condemnation available in the tradition. The Cherem text, read in full, uses language that prohibits oral communication with Spinoza, written communication, commercial contact, residential proximity, and the transmission of any of his work. It is, as my colleague in the corridor noted, a quarantine protocol. What changed between April 1655 and July 1656? Spinoza continued writing. He continued investigating. The work that would become his 1770 analysis of the biblical texts, the systematic demonstration that these texts were human productions, made for political purposes, and that the institutions built on them had systematically misrepresented their origins. That work was advancing, becoming more precise, moving toward the conclusions that, once in print, could not be recalled. The question of the question is what I want to leave you with. Not where is the body, but why does the uncertainty persist? Let me tell you about the last time I was in Amsterdam. This was some years before this channel existed. I was there for a few days, part of a longer research trip. I had spent the morning in a library in the south of the city and walked north, somewhat aimlessly, into the older parts of the center. There is a particular quality to the light in Amsterdam in late November. Gray, flat, the canals reflecting a sky that is the same color as the stone, the bridges and the narrow houses, and the smell of canal water, and somewhere behind that, the faint residual smell of coffee from a cafe I had passed. I was near the Zwanenburgwal, the area where the Portuguese Jewish community lived in the 17th century, where Spinoza's family had their home, where the attack in April 1655 is believed to have occurred, though the precise location is not recorded with the specificity that later historians would have preferred. There is a monument to Spinoza in that part of the city, a bronze figure, life-size, or near enough to read as life-size. He is standing. He holds a book. His eyes are slightly downcast, the way a man looks when he is thinking rather than performing. I stood in front of it for longer than I had intended to, not because of the statue, because of the location. A few minutes' walk, at most, from where someone had come at him with a knife. A bronze figure where a living man had been attacked. A city that had tried to erase Spinoza, now preserving him in bronze, making him a landmark, allowing tourists to photograph him. This is the thing about institutional management of dangerous thinkers. You can excommunicate them while they live. You can suppress the circulation of their work, prohibit discussion of their ideas, instruct every member of your community to treat them as though they are dead. And then, 3 centuries later, when the institution's survival no longer depends on the suppression, you can bronze them. You can put them on postcards. You can refer to them as one of the city's great figures. But the specific question that got Spinoza attacked, not the big question, not the existence of God, not the authenticity of the scriptures, the specific, procedural, historical question he was asking about where Jesus' body was and why the institutional answer is what it is. That question has not been put in bronze. That question is not on postcards. I stood there in the gray November afternoon, the canal water moving slowly somewhere behind me, the bronze figure looking at its book, and I thought about what Spinoza actually concluded. Not, I know where the body is. He was a careful man. He did not claim to know things he could not demonstrate. What he concluded, and what I think remains 370 years later, exactly as dangerous as it was when someone came at him with a knife, is this. He did not claim to know where Jesus' body was. He claimed to know why the uncertainty was maintained, and he claimed to know who benefits from it. A religion whose founder's burial place is uncertain cannot have that uncertainty resolved by archaeology. A sacred location that has been built on a site identified by imperial decree in the 4th century cannot be submitted to the kind of investigation that would definitively confirm or disconfirm it without raising questions about institutional authority that the institution cannot answer. The uncertainty is not a problem that has not been solved. The uncertainty is a solution. It is maintained because the alternative, a fully investigated, archaeologically examined, historically documented account of where and how Jesus' body was buried would require the institution to participate in an investigation that could only damage it. Spinoza kept the slashed cloak. I have thought about that detail more times than I can count. He could have had it repaired. He could have discarded it. A man of his circumstances, living modestly, grinding lenses in Amsterdam, sustained by small bequests from friends who valued what he was doing, did not have so many coats that he could afford to keep a damaged one out of sentimentality. He kept it because it was evidence. Evidence that someone had tried to silence him and failed, and that the failure was itself a form of testimony. The cloak survives in description, in an account written just years after Spinoza's death, and in the testimony of his landlord. A record indicates that Spinoza spoke of it with what might be called quiet satisfaction. The institution that ordered the attack still controls the narrative. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre stands on a site identified by imperial decree in 326. The mortar analysis of 2016 confirmed that the physical structure dates to the 4th century. The first 300 years of Christian history contain no recoverable record of the tomb's location. The Taupiot tomb was discovered in 1980, documented partially, resealed, and placed in a category of objects that it is professionally inconvenient to examine too carefully. And Spinoza's question, not where is the body, but who benefits from the incertitude, sits in the archive that Cherem tried to create, available to anyone willing to follow the argument to where it leads. He kept the slashed cloak. The cloak is the argument. The argument is still there. Take care of yourselves.
In 2012, I spent 2 weeks in the Vatican archives. What I saw there, they never let anyone publish. Spinoza was right about everything, and I'm going to show you the evidence they don't want you to see.